They say the loudest screams are the ones nobody ever hears. On a quiet summer night in June 1912, the air in the small town of Villisca, Iowa, was heavy and still. It was the kind of humid, Midwestern night where the world seems to hold its breath. In a modest, whitewood frame house on a quiet residential street, 8 people went to sleep, unaware that they were entering a darkness from which they would never wake. 6 of them were children, the youngest only 5 years old, tucked into their beds after a long day of laughter. By morning, this house would become the center of one of the most baffling, brutal, and haunting unsolved mysteries in American history. But the true horror wasn't just in the violence of the act, it was in the absolute, terrifying silence that accompanied it. To understand the tragedy, you have to imagine the Moore household as it was that evening. It was a typical Sunday, filled with the warmth of community. Josiah and Sarah Moore, well-respected and prosperous, had spent the day at the local Presbyterian church for the Children's Day service. Their 4 children were there, glowing with the excitement of the festivities. They had even invited 2 neighborhood girls, the Stillinger sisters, to stay the night so the fun wouldn't have to end. Neighbors recalled hearing the sounds of a happy home, the faint notes of a piano, the clinking of silverware during a late supper, and the muffled chatter of children. Then, one by one, the oil lamps were pinched out. The house fell into shadows. But the house was not empty. Somewhere in the suffocating heat of the attic, a figure was waiting. He hadn't forced a door or broken a window in the dead of night. No, he had been there for hours. He had been crouched in the crawl space, listening to the family breathe, watching through the narrow cracks in the floorboards as the children said their bedtime prayers and the parents shared their final quiet words. He waited with a patience that was nothing short of predatory. He waited until the rhythm of the house slowed into the deep, heavy slumber of the midnight hour. What followed was a nightmare executed with the kind of surgical precision that suggests a mind completely detached from humanity. The killer descended from the attic, gripping a long-handled axe he had found in the backyard. He moved from room to room like a phantom. He didn't use the sharp, biting edge of the blade to spill blood quickly. Instead, he used the blunt, heavy back of the axe head. He struck his victims while they were still lost in their dreams, ensuring they never had a second to realize the monster had arrived. But here is where the silent screams truly begin to echo. In a house full of 8 people, not a single neighbor heard a sound. There was no crashing furniture, no desperate struggle, not even the rhythmic creak of a floorboard under a heavy tread. The killer had meticulously prepared for the silence. He had wrapped the head of the axe in a heavy cloth to muffle the sickening thud of the impacts. He was a ghost in the shadows, systematic, mechanical, and devastatingly cold. He moved through the house with a familiarity that suggested he knew exactly where every bed was placed, navigating the darkness without ever stumbling. When the bodies were discovered the next morning by a worried neighbor, the townspeople found a scene that defied all human logic. The killer hadn't just committed the act and fled into the night. He had stayed. He had lingered in the house of the dead for hours. In a display of ritualistic bizarreness, he had gone through every room and covered every single mirror and glass surface. He used strips of clothing, bedsheets, and even pieces of gauze to hide every reflection in the house. Why? Some believe he was driven by a dark, rural superstition that if a mirror is left uncovered in a room with the dead, their souls will be trapped in the glass forever. Others believe the killer possessed a shred of a soul that couldn't bear to see his own reflection in the eyes of his victims or the silver glass on the walls. He wanted to be alone with his work, hidden even from himself. The strangeness didn't end there. In the kitchen, investigators found a bowl of bloody water sitting on the table, placed next to a plate of uneaten food. The killer had stood there, calmly washing the red from his hands, perhaps even watching the sun begin to peek over the horizon, before vanishing into the morning mist as if he had never existed. For decades, the police and private detectives hunted for answers that refused to come. They turned the town upside down. They looked at a traveling preacher with a history of mental instability who had been in town that night. They looked at a powerful state senator who reportedly held a bitter, long-standing grudge against Josiah Moore over a business dispute. They even looked at the possibility of a nomadic serial killer known as the Midwest Axeman, who was suspected of leaving similar trails of silence in houses across the country. But every lead, every suspect, and every theory eventually turned into a cold, dead end. The axe remains in evidence, the house still stands as a macabre tourist destination, and the mirrors have long since been uncovered. But the questions still linger in the air like a cold draft in an empty hallway. How does a person vanish into a small, tight-knit town without leaving a single trace? How does an entire family of 8 disappear into the night without making a sound that could wake a neighbor just feet away? We look back at these moments not just to be scared, but to acknowledge the voices that were cut short in the dark. The victims of Villisca never got to tell their story. They were denied even the chance to cry out. Their final moments were stolen by a shadow that knew exactly how to manipulate the dark and the silence. As you go to sleep tonight, you might find yourself listening a little closer to the way your own house settles in the cold. You might notice the way the moonlight stretches strangely across your own mirrors. Because the most frightening thing in this world isn't the sound of a scream in the night. It's the realization that sometimes the most violent acts are the ones that happen in total, unbroken silence. The Moore family took their secrets to the grave, leaving us only with the echo of what happened within those 4 white walls. It is a story told in whispers, a history written in blood, a silent scream that has been ringing out, unheard, for over 100 years.